Welcome to the Week 2 Salary Exploitation. I'm Jason Gilbo, J Gilbo 11. With me is Russell Clay at Russell J Clay. Taking a look at some guys on various positions between DraftKings, FanDuel, and FantasyDraft. This week, definitely kind of more of some discrepancies between the three sites.
Yeah, as we get into week two, things start to solidify. We're not really working with, 2015 data, FanDuel, DraftKings, and we're using Fantasy Draft. Their algorithms sometimes go in different directions, and we're starting to see that. So yeah, definitely going to be fun to look at the site to site differences.
Yeah, definitely. And jumping in at quarterbacks here, you get two guys. You mentioned Marcus Mariota taking on the Lions. Where do you feel like he's kind of the most bang for his buck there?
I love his DraftKings price, and it's funny because he was the first guy I really looked at, and it's such a difference from week one because FanDuel and DK were so similar. But I don't really like his price on FanDuel at all. Like I might, not really get any exposure at all at 7,500. But at 6K on DK, I feel like that's basically minimum for a guy who looked really good and for a guy whose running game looked really good last week. The Lions obviously struggled mightily against Andrew Luck and what could be a very elite passing game this year. But I think Mariota's in a great spot. I mean, we already knew about Delaney Walker. We already knew, that run game was at least going to be okay. Looks like he has Derrick Henry to dump the ball off too. And I mean, Tajay Sharp, seven catches for 60 yards. I think that could be a thing moving forward. So along with that rushing ability, I think he's got that nice built-in floor. So Mariota, I'm not going to say cash yet because we're very early in the week, but he might be a cash play for me on DK.
Yeah, I definitely like him a lot. And as you mentioned, I think the addition of Sharp is kind of what's pushed me into the borderline cash range because it just does give him another option to use. And 11 targets for him, I mean, in week one. So I like it. I think it's an interesting stack as well. So yeah, I like Mariota's price. As you mentioned, FanDuel a little bit off. Fantasy Draft pretty relevant as well.
Yeah, I like that. The price there as well. Next one here. News just basically came out a little while ago. Josh McCown going to be starting for the Browns this week. Robert Griffin headed to the not season ending IR, but like this, I believe it's like 6 or 8 weeks, and then he can look to come back. But yeah, for the short term, it's all Josh McCown. It's all Gary Barnidge again. All the stats are being thrown out by the Roto World guys right now, Evan Silva and Rich Rebar, that, Barnidge was a top 10 tight end pretty much every week. McCown was in there. So we're looking at him again. We're looking at Duke Johnson. I mean, Corey Coleman's there. That wasn't there last year, so he's got a nice deep threat to go to. I think this is great. You're going to get him at the min price on all three sites, and not much discrepancy here. I think you're in play for all three here. McCown, min price quarterback. Love it.
So, I mean, could we eventually just get to like each week we have one bare min price quarterback that's viable option? Because it's just, we're already here. Week one, it was Dak Prescott. Here we go. Week two, Josh McCown. And we saw McCown, be pretty viable last year in certain spots. I mean, he wasn't a bad value quarterback at times.
I actually feel like I'm much more comfortable with this than I was with Dak, just because we've seen McCown, have at least some sort of success before. And I mean, Dak kind of played out how you kind of expected. I mean, he didn't get any good breaks. Obviously, that touchdown to Dez got called back, but they really are just a dink and dunk offense without Romo, and that's what it's going to be, and banking it on the running game. So, yeah, we'll talk about him later in the week, but yeah,
Yeah. It wasn't an impressive start, but as you mentioned, a couple unlucky things kind of factored into it. Looking at running backs here, as you talked about, DeMarco Murray kind of hinted at him. Where do you like his price the best? I mean, it seems like that DraftKings price is pretty reasonable.
5,700. I'm all in on that. The Lions offense might not be as bad as we sort of saw or assumed after week one with the Colts offense, but I'd like DeMarco Murray. He looked good. I was a detractor for most of the offseason after last year. I just was not in on him anymore. But this looks good. I mean, this is a good matchup. He's looked good in the preseason and now one regular season game. They're using him in the passing game. Obviously, those two receiving touchdowns. 5,700 on DraftKings is a great price. 74 is where I think he's most accurately priced, which I'm still in on. But DK, he's a cash option. So that's what I'm seriously looking at there. I'm going to get shares on all three sites, but overall, DK cash, yeah.
Yeah, I think that FanDuel 7,400 makes him a little bit more of a swerve off of some guys in that range. In the fantasy draft price at 10.7 is really not that bad either. In terms of Tevin Coleman, a lot of the kind of talk of the town here of late. I mean, we looked at what he did with Devontae Freeman. He was clearly the more dominant back in week one, and still, cheap across the board here.
That's what I did when Tevin Coleman had a good game this weekend. Just a big sigh of relief that I'm not a complete idiot for liking him last year out of Indiana. I mean, this is what he is. Get him in space and just let that athletic ability, let that speed, let that burst take over. So as long as they keep getting those dump offs out there to him, he's going to be a dominant player in those types of situations. I still like Devonta Freeman. I think he's a good player still. I don't care what everyone else is saying. He's still going to have a role there. But as far as Coleman goes, I mean, this is definitely a positive indicator. I like his price on FanDuel. NDK, fantasy draft is nice as well. Pretty reduced there. So I think we're looking at him on all three sites. I like him on DK and fantasy draft more than FanDuel. But overall, I think he's in play in tournaments on all sites. Raiders are going to be an improved defense this year. But as far as Coleman goes, he's pretty agnostic to actually what the opposing defense looks like. As long as he keeps getting those dump offs, going to be tough for any linebacker to stay with him.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, when you look on those PPR sites too, that definitely gives him a better floor, and then for that price gives him a bit more of a points per dollar value. Jumping into wide receivers here, Willie Snead coming off a monster week against Oakland. His prices, I mean, took a little bit of a rise. Obviously, DraftKings, he's up about $1,000. FanDuel though, 7,200 is a little pricey.
So yeah, I'm looking at him as DK only this week. I still think he's viable on FanDuel, but really just more of a tournament swerve than an actual good play there. I think this is the most weapons Drew Brees has ever had in his career, and I think there's just going to be weeks where you're not in the game plan, and I think that's what Kobe Fleener was looking at week one. A lot of people are going to be thinking that he's just totally not in the offense anymore. I do not think that's the case. I look at the Giants this week, and I think this is a nice week to actually go back to Fleener. I didn't throw him in here, but that's kind of what I'm looking at. But I mean, you can't ignore what Snead did. He's going to be a big part of this offense all year. So 5,800, I'm certainly willing to throw him in there on DK and in pretty much all formats.
Yeah, I think so too. And I mean, it also could be said that, you look at Snead and his improved price, it's up there a little bit on all three sites. Might be kind of those ones where people might look to chase, and that's where maybe you take a move and you list two other guys below here. Obviously, Travis Benjamin, with the Keenan Allen news is going to slip in and see some more targets. And at his kind of bottom line price, I mean, it might be worth a look to take some shots there.
Yeah, he's more of a value on DK than FanDuel. But overall, I mean, I just think he's worth potentially getting a deep shot. I think the Jaguars offense is going to crush the Chargers, secondary. And I just think this is a game where the Chargers are going to be down, 21-0. Halftime, and then they're just going to be plugging away the whole second half. Even if Benjamin doesn't necessarily get a deep shot, behind Keenan, they were just so thin. So I think Benjamin's going to see a huge bump in targets. So this is a potentially big role for him to step into. And the Jaguars, while I think they're better than what they showed last week, they're really young. They're prone to making mistakes. We saw that a few times in the Packers game. I think Benjamin's a pretty solid play.
Yeah, definitely do too. I mean, he's definitely going to get, a tick up in targets. I mean, hard not to like him against a Jags defense that, we've talked about them. They are going to be improved, but I don't think quite yet where we're going to be shying away.
Before you introduce this next one, I just want to preface this and say Vincent Jackson may be dead. He might be dead in terms of fantasy football. But His price is really reduced this week on DraftKings and Fantasy Draft. I'm not touching him on FanDuel. That's for sure. But on DK at 4K and Fantasy Draft at 7,800, I'm looking at him in tournaments. This will be the last week I take a chance on him if he doesn't do anything. But I just think with Mike Evans there, just takes so much of the focus of the offense. With Charles Sims coming out of the backfield, that's going to be where Tyrann Mathieu's looking. I just think Vincent Jackson, this is his last week for me. And if he doesn't do anything, I'm fine with completely fading him for the rest of the year. But I think at these prices, he's worth a gamble in tournaments, especially on DK and Fantasy Draft.
So you have that notebook of do not plays, and he's in pencil. You can still erase him, but after this week, if it's nothing, that's going in permanent marker.
This week one was okay, Vincent Jackson. You have a good matchup. Let's see what you can do. He didn't do anything. This week, everyone's going to be off him. He's got a reduced price, so we still got the contrarian angle with him. If he doesn't do anything this week, I'm out.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Yep. That's how we're looking at Vincent Jackson. I mean, he is, he's getting up there in age, way past his prime. Still could be the deep threat, and that's what's kind of holding him in. He gets those deep targets. So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we saw that Cardinals defense. I mean, obviously Patrick Peterson's your standout corner. But we saw, guys like Chris Hogan, was able to get a deep one. I mean, we saw a couple shots where the Patriots almost really beat him deep. So Vincent Jackson is in line for that opportunity.
Definitely.
In terms of tight ends, you list two cheap guys here. You talked about Jason Witten last week being one of the kind of the standout options, and it truly showed with what he did. I mean, he was just kind of that safety blanket for Prescott. And on DraftKings, he turned out being a great play just because of that PPR value.
And I kind of threw Cole Beasley in just because I wanted to throw Cole Beasley in to give him some credit because he's actually on an NFL roster. But they used him a lot. And I think that's sort of someone to potentially look at too, because Dak, he took a few deep shots, but overall it's going to be, 10 yards, 5 yards, 5 yards. He's just dinking and dunking. They're really praying that offensive line and Zeke are going to carry them, and maybe a little Alfred Morris too. So I think Jason Witten's going to be viable even in cash until, he gets really expensive. I think you just keep firing away with him. Until further notice. That's just what you're going to be doing. I like him on all three sites. Obviously priced him up more on FanDuel. Only $200 more expensive on DK this week. I think he's, borderline cash game viable on DK. So FanDuel probably just stick to tournaments. But yeah, overall, his role is pretty set. I think we're going to see a vintage Jason Witten at least first half of the season.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And another name you mentioned here, sticking with the value, Vance McDonald at Carolina. Obviously, McDonald, they're out in San Francisco. Kind of one of the only options. There's really only a few options you can really take from this 49ers team, and they all are very cheap. So what kind of appeals to you about him?
Well, his game hasn't played yet, so we don't know. And I mentioned that in the article. But what I was going to say is, my read on week one is that he's really the only guy I trust in terms of as an athletic prospect, as a receiving option that has he showed solid production last year on this team, and we just can't really say that for anyone else on this offense right now. So, we like Torrey Smith as a deep threat, but that doesn't really mean much in this offense right now. So I like Vance McDonald. He's basically min price. Especially on FanDuel, I love that price because Witten's not there this week. He's priced up. A lot of these guys are priced up after week one. Vance, they didn't get to see him play. 46 could be super chalky this week on FanDuel.
Yeah, definitely agree. There could be a lot of potential there, and a lot of potential, especially at those prices. Cheap across the board. Looking at defenses, and obviously you were talking about kind of that Cowboys dink and dunk offense. That puts the Redskins in an actual decent spot there against them. And I like these prices that you listed here: 2,800 on DK, very reasonable. 44 on FanDuel, 55 on FantasyDraft. So could be quite the bargain.
And one thing we didn't see from Dak is that rushing ability. Really, they seemed like their game plan was, all right, he's not going to run all that much. So, with that considered, the threat of him going off isn't really there as much. So I mean, I would be worried about that if he was just taken off every time, like a Colin Kaepernick or something like that, because the Redskins, every defense is, a little worried about that. But Redskins have a pretty decent front seven. They got Josh Norman in the offseason. He's going to be on Dez. Again, kind of like Jarvis Landry versus Seahawks last week. I like Witten, but at the same time, Witten's production's not going to necessarily kill your Redskins defense score. So I like them on all sites. As far as my other team, the Rams here, Russell Wilson might not play. Love the Rams front seven. They've played the Seahawks really well. One of the best teams against the Seahawks over the last few years. And that offensive line is a big problem. Without Russell Wilson there, I could see, the Rams getting a ton of pressure, not having that elite athlete in the backfield to, scramble away. So it could get really ugly. I really like the Rams. They're a cash defense for me.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Wilson, it's like he's the glue that kind of holds everything together. You take him out, all those wide receivers instantly lose a ton of value. That backfield loses a ton of value. And as you mentioned, I mean, the Rams have played them well over the past few seasons.
Right.
So that's going to wrap things up with the salary exploitation for week 2. Be sure to check out the rest of our content and tools at dailyfantasycafe.com.